Most accidents in tree work occur for one of two reasons. It's either a novice worker and the thing the accident comes from something they didn't even know to expect, or it's a more experienced, more competent worker making a mistake or doing something they know they shouldn't. So for the novice worker, they're conducting a task that's actually beyond the level of their competency and experience. They're maybe performing a rigging operation, and there are so many variables that they don't know to look out for the one that gets them. Maybe they're worrying about how do they get the cuts right, and then the piece gets rigged off perfectly and then swings back and hit them. And they didn't even know to look out for that. So that's why, particularly in the first years of someone's career in tree work, they so desperately need that help from a mentor, a more experienced person who's watching out for them, who can identify those things, which of course they don't have the knowledge to see for themselves. The other kind of accident occurs to more experienced, more competent workers conducting a task they may have conducted many times before. And those accidents occur through sloppiness, through shortcuts, through fatigue, and through mistakes. A lot of the time, as an experienced worker conducting a task that you've done many times before, you kind of know in advance something's not quite right. You have that feeling that you haven't quite set the cuts up right, or this is getting a little bit ropey, or something like that. And then when you go ahead and the accident happens, there's a part of you wondering, well, I kind of knew that was going to happen. You kind of knew that it was pushing the line a bit, and you chose to go ahead regardless. So this short video presentation is going to be looking at why do we carry on and make those cuts anyway? Why do we carry on with something we know is high risk? And how do we get better at recognizing when our decision-making ability is compromised? And how do we get better at making good, safe decisions for tree work? To understand why we make bad decisions and why we take risks and we take shortcuts while we're doing tree work, we need to understand a bit more about how the brain works as we're making decisions.
It's not uncommon for people to think that the way we make decisions is based on logical or rational processes that we are fully aware of and have complete control over the decisions that we make. However, recent neuroscientific evidence suggests that it's more complicated than that we make decisions based on subconscious processes and that they largely inform the way that we make decisions. One way to very simply describe how we go about making decisions is called the triune brain model. And this is a model which suggests that the brain has three different regions which do different things. The first region is known as the reptilian brain, or the survival brain. And this part largely focuses on bodily functions such as our heart rate, our breathing, our sleep, and our level of alertness. It also acts kind of like a gateway or a messenger between the body and the brain, and that helps us make quick decisions in split seconds. The second region of the brain is called the paleomammalian brain, or the emotional brain, and this area helps us focus and respond to different emotions and form and retrieve memories and connect socially with other people. Interestingly, the survival and the emotional parts of the brain are not under our conscious control, and they work below the surface of our awareness. The third region of our brain is called the neomammalian brain, or the rational brain, and this region controls most functions related to our conscious awareness. It helps us process our thoughts and our perceptions, and this can colour our moral and ethical decision-making abilities, and it also controls our executive functions, such as our ability to problem solve, our ability to make plans and understand the consequences of our actions and our decisions. It's really important to know that these regions of the brain do not work in isolation. In a healthy, well-developed brain, these three regions are really well integrated and in constant communication with each other. And this gives us a more comprehensive picture of what's going on inside of our bodies and our minds, and this allows us to be more efficient and effective in our environment.
So 3 parts of the brain, and all 3 of those parts help us with decision making. But let's have a look at them in isolation, which is, of course, it's just hypothetical looking at them this way, but it'll give us an idea of the different kinds of process that you might use for different kinds of decision making. So let's look at the rational brain first. To get an idea of what rational decision-making could look like, we can examine a hypothetical rigging situation and try and work out if it's safe to conduct using purely rational decision-making processes. So, as an example of rational decision making, the example we're going to be looking at is a question relating to imagine that you're up at the top of a tree, there's a significant amount of decay in the stem underneath you, and you need to decide whether it's safe to wriggle the head out of the tree. Rational decision making requires quantifiable, definable inputs, and it uses quantifiable, definable processes. So that's going to look like taking measurements of the extent of the decay, taking measurements of the weight, the volume of the section you're going to cut, working out how far the piece will fall during rigging, what the peak force will be on the rigging components, and then using further information like the known Young's modulus of the timber, the impact that the decay will have, the lever arm between your rigging point and the size of the decay. We're going to be using all of that, using quite complex equations to work out exactly how much the peak force is going to be that's applied at the area of weakness, and also whether the structure of the tree at that point will be strong enough to sustain that load. And of course, if you're doing tree work regularly, you'll know that never happens. That's not how we work out if it's safe to proceed. And in fact, in studies in the UK, asking some of the world's most renowned arborists and physicists to estimate peak loads in rigging operation, they found that even those people who specialize in estimating forces in rigging are regularly wrong by about 50 or more %. There's so many unknowns in this. Like, how much stretch will the rope have? How strong is the timber actually? How much is decay compromised it? It would be hard to assess this accurately, even if you were working in lab conditions. Even if you were able to weigh all of the components and you knew the exact strength of the rope and the exact elastic elongation, you'd still struggle to work it out accurately. But still, to look at that in more detail, a rational process, the inputs into the process are things like quantifiable measurements, known data, so things like the specific gravity of the timber you're working in. And of course, you'll need the calculations. So you'll need tested calculations for working out things like peak force, working out things like the load, and working out how much the decay has compromised the strength of the tree. So of course, this is completely hypothetical, but some of the good things about rational decision making are that the outputs are easy to communicate by speaking or writing. So they're clearly defined and it's repeatable. At its heart, the scientific approach of repeatable experiments is based on this. It should be possible to create a test which another person on the other side of the world who's never met you could repeat. Because it's quantifiable, it means it's easy to communicate. So things that are quantifiable, so for example, the well-known method of measuring whether a tree will, where the height of the tree will hit if you fell it. You stand in where you think the point of the tree will hit, and you hold up a stick at arm's length, and then you move backwards and forwards until the length of your stick appears to be the same as the height of the tree. That is a rational process. It's one that you could explain to another worker, and in theory they would arrive at the same result. The data is generally verifiable, so if you've said that a tree will land at a particular spot using this method, we can then fell the tree and test the method. And in theory, if it was a purely rational decision-making process, it wouldn't be heavily influenced by other factors such as emotions, such as whether you're stressed at the time, your diet, things like that. Of course, the weaknesses of rational decision-making when it comes to tree work are that it's almost impossible to use. The number of unknowns in the rigging scenario we just described make a rational investigation of whether it will be successful almost impossible. It's very time-consuming. I mean, it's mentally labor-intensive to try and calculate all of those things. And of course, if we went about tree work like that, we'd never get anything done. Another thing that's important to know is it's easy to make serious mistakes. I mean, an experienced worker's sort of gut instinct about something will usually be fairly right. When you try and calculate it scientifically, even if you used all of the correct data, the slightest error in your calculations could end up telling you that it's safe to do something that really isn't. So a few issues with that. So almost all the decisions we make in tree work are made using subconscious parts of the brain, and we experience those not as testable numbers or as formula or anything like that. We experience those as the instinct, the intuition, the emotion, the feeling that it's okay to proceed with a particular operation. So up there on that tree, getting ready to make the cut, you're not going to quantify everything and calculate the peak force. Instead, you're going to rely on your experience to analyze the information and the feeling that it's okay to proceed. So let's look at that emotional decision-making process in more detail. We're still thinking of the same thing, the same question. If I rig the piece here, will the trunk fail at that cavity beneath me? And the inputs this time are observations. You don't need to actually carefully measure the extent of the cavity or the height of the tree or the angle between you or the actual volume of the piece you're rigging. You're relying on your memory of similar problems, your procedural memory, your observations, and all of this is getting processed using the vast power of your subconscious brain. You'll experience it as a feeling that something will work or not. It's hard to define or quantify or discuss or clearly explain. So that's why you'll see an experienced worker can go up a tree and get to a particular spot and they're feeling the tree wobbling in a strange way, or something just feels wrong and they decide not to proceed with the operation. But it's not something that they could clearly define and explain fully to another worker, to a novice worker, in a way that would let the novice worker apply that later on the next tree. That they're analyzing data that they haven't quantified. So what they get is this feeling that it's okay to proceed, or it's not okay to proceed, or something's wrong, or this feels fine. And it's very hard for that to be explained in a way that's usable by another worker. For an experienced operator, the subconscious decision-making process is normally very trustworthy and reliable. When you're using those processes to analyze a task that you've conducted many times before, you're drawing on all the wealth of your experience when you make that decision. And it is normally an extremely reliable and accurate way of making decisions. The only real issues are that subconscious decision-making can be a bit lazy, can be prone to selecting comfortable and familiar solutions rather than making the effort to really think about the other possible ways of doing something. It's also affected by other factors such as diet, stress, fatigue, emotion, and social pressure, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. So having looked at that, it would be easy to think that the rational part of our brain is almost completely useless for tree work.
Actually, it would be a mistake to view the different regions of the brain as acting in isolation of each other. The brain is an integrated structure, so it depends on each region of the brain working and communicating together to work most effectively and efficiently. But we really can't underestimate how much control the emotional brain has over us when we make decisions. Research has shown that people make decisions anywhere between half a second up to 7 seconds before we're even consciously aware that we've made that decision. When our subconscious brain makes a decision, our rational brain then creates a narrative or a story around that decision, which makes us feel like that decision is based on logic alone, when in fact our emotional brain has played the biggest role in making that decision. Think of a car advertisement as an example. On the TV, we see this shiny, powerful car out in the wilderness being driven by beautiful people who are adventurous and happy and rich and trendy. And these people are everything that we want to be and could be if only we had this particular car. These advertisements target our emotional brain and make us think that we need this brand new car. Now, if we go out and buy this car, we're not going to say that the car ad had an emotional impact on us because we're not consciously aware of that. Instead, our rational brain creates a story around the depreciation of value of your old car, the tax benefits for purchasing a new car, and that the fact that getting this new four-wheel drive means you might go out and do more camping with friends and family. But the truth is that those images we saw on the screen of people being the best versions of themselves, because they had this brand new car, has a deeply emotional impact on us that greatly influences our decisions to buy this car.
So good decision making uses the different parts of the brain all working together. And a lot of the time, as Jessie said, we'll make the decision first using our memory, our experience, the emotional part of our brain, and then we'll explain it to ourselves using the rational part of our brain. And as we explain it to ourselves, we create that narrative that we can then explain to someone else. So to go back to our example of, you're at the top of the tree, you're trying to decide whether to rake the head out or not, and you're worried about the cavity underneath you. An experienced, competent professional has been in that situation before. They can assess this vast range of factors. They know what it's going to feel like in a tree without the cavity. They know how much force it's going to put on. They know, is it going to be a really big, shocking, violent operation, or is it going to go smoothly? And they can also assess the extent of the decay. They've probably worked in similar trees before. They can rely on this huge wealth of experience and information that it would be impossible to process with your rational brain. They make the decision, and then when they're asked to explain why it was okay, they can create a narrative around that. They can explain it to themselves rationally. I used this particular rigging operation to minimize the force, and we did it this way, and I cut it here, and all those things together mean that the force involved won't be enough to break the tree at the cavity. So that's an example of a sort of standard decision-making process, and it's very powerful. A competent and an experienced operator should trust that emotional decision-making process. They should trust their experience. They should trust their procedural memory. They should trust their intuition, and they should trust their instincts. And all put together, that's what the process will look like when everything's going well. But what we touched on briefly before is the other inputs to the emotional decision-making process. Things like fatigue, stress, diet, all of that impacts on the decision-making process, and it impacts on the outcome of the decision-making process as well. So some of those other inputs, they include things like diet, the stress and fatigue, social pressure, your environment. All of that's going to impact how you feel about going ahead with a particular operation. And that can have a few different results. At its worst, it can result in laziness or shortcuts. So that's both laziness of decision making, and it's laziness with doing the job the right way. It can also result in overconfidence or trying to do something that you don't really know the result of. So let's look at diet first. The graph we're showing here compares a high sugar diet, which is the red line, with a healthy diet, which is the green line. And it's just very simplified. It's just showing the variations in your energy level with the different kinds of diet. And obviously with the green line there, you're staying in the ideal energy level for most of the day. The danger of that high sugar diet, so things like sugary drinks, white bread, coffee, chocolates and lollies, sports drinks, things like that, is you get these energy highs at the start of the day when you're really almost buzzing. You're up there into the tree, you're in a huge rush, taking shortcuts, racing around, hyperactive, burning your energy really fast. You're burning through all that sugar really fast. And then mid-morning, late morning, you get that sugar crash. So you've burnt through all of that sugary energy, and now you're in a real low before lunch. Low energy levels result in fatigue, hunger. People start taking shortcuts. They look at a particular job and it just feels too difficult to get out there and do it properly. So they'll take the shortcut. They'll cut it in one piece, or they'll fell it when they're not quite sure that they really ought to. Or they'll fell it without setting a line, because the whole procedure of going and getting the throw line and setting it starts to feel harder and harder. And this isn't just arborists who suffer with these problems. Studies of the sentencing prescribed by judges in US courts has found that for the same crime, sentences tend to be low first thing in the morning, and then they become more and more severe up until coffee break, when the judges are getting fatigued and they can't be bothered listening to it, or they can't be bothered empathizing with the person who's being charged. It all gets too difficult and the sentences get higher. The same thing would be worth thinking about for consultants writing tree reports. I mean, we know that when they're feeling confident, they'll have a good look, they'll really think about it hard, and they'll be prepared to take the risk of, recommending mitigation works in retaining the tree. Then on a different day where they're hungry, they're tired, it might all seem a bit too difficult, and they'd be prone to recommending tree removal, possibly for the same tree. Some other things that caused fatigue and stress, and we'll come back to stress later on in this presentation, but things like alcohol or drugs, illness, problems at home, all of those are going to cause fatigue and stress. Fatigue and stress definitely results in poor decisions and an increased tolerance of risk. Fatigue can result in an inability to consider complex solutions. So in that circumstance, something, it might be a more complex way of performing the task, but it takes a few more steps. It's a little bit harder to think about. And as workers get more tired, it gets harder and harder to make the effort to choose that more complex solution. Communication is also impacted. It gets harder to explain something that's tricky. So I'm sure any tree workers would have had the experience of trying to explain, how to tie a knot from 50 meters away, for example. It's hard enough when you're feeling comfortable and relaxed and happy. Once you're stressed or fatigued or you're tired or you're in the middle of something else, it becomes almost impossible to communicate that complex idea. Fatigue also leads to shortcuts and low effort solutions and a hugely increased tolerance of risk. Let's look at that in a bit more detail. This graph shows fatigue along the bottom axis. So we're going from rested to quite tired to extremely tired. That's where we've got lack of sleep, we're hungry, we're exhausted, we're overheated, we haven't had enough water to drink. And as fatigue increases, the tolerance of risk to yourself increases. So you'll be more prepared to take a risky shortcut just to get the job over with. But what's particularly interesting is that huge increase in the tolerance of risk to others. At the start of the day, you might be really watching out for your ground crew. And then as the day wears on, your tolerance of risk to them increases. You're prepared to drop stuff a bit closer to them. It's really worth knowing and worrying about. And the last thing to talk about, the last input to the emotional decision-making process, are things like social pressure, ego, and poor management. So those are social inputs as well. So particularly for novice tree workers, but for anyone, putting pressure on them to perform, to do a particular job they're worried about puts them in a very dangerous position, because it's yet another input into that emotional decision-making process that is telling them to go ahead and do it. And that's in conflict with maybe their instinct, which is saying, it's not safe to proceed, I can't do this. You're piling on this pressure to carry on and do it regardless. I mean, that's obviously dangerous, but it's worth understanding how that impacts the emotional decision-making process, how that social pressure, that ego or managerial pressure telling them to just get it done, how that can cause them to go ahead with task or a risky process that their rational brain could easily tell them was dangerous. And in fact, their emotional brain could tell them it was dangerous as well. But the pressure we've put them under has caused them to override that.
So we talked about the triune brain model in relation to decision-making processes, and we can also use this same model to talk about how stress impacts the brain. In a stressful event, our brain redirects energy away from the rational part of the brain to the emotional and survival areas of the brain. And it does this because using our rational brain to make decisions is an inherently really slow process. If we find ourselves face to face with a tiger, for instance, we aren't going to rationalize that experience and calculate the distance between us and the tiger and how fast we can run compared to the tiger, because those precious few seconds that we have could mean the difference between life and death. So what the brain does is it focuses all its energy on using the emotional and survival regions of the brain to make those split-second decisions so that we can respond quickly to stress or danger. This process is extremely helpful in dangerous situations. However, it can be pretty detrimental in less severe situations where our ability to plan and understand consequences, communicate with others, and problem solve is more important than simply reacting without any thought. Our brain and our body communicate together via our autonomic nervous system. And our autonomic nervous system means simply that the process is automatic. We don't have conscious control over it. The autonomic nervous system can be separated into two different branches. One is the parasympathetic nervous system, and the other is the sympathetic nervous system. These systems are complementary to each other, and they sort of act like a messaging system between our brain and our body. And they do this by sending electrical impulses to help us regulate our level of stress. The parasympathetic nervous system is largely activated when we feel safe and relaxed and social with others, and it triggers a whole range of physiological changes in the body to help us continue feeling this way. Our bodies are receptive to relaxing for sleep, our heart rate is slow and even, we feel ready to eat and digest food, and we don't need much energy to be in this state, so it restricts the release of glucose in the body. The feedback loop that occurs between the brain and the body reinforces the feeling of being calm and well regulated. The sympathetic nervous system is dominant when we are faced with a threat or we're feeling quite stressed, and this triggers a fight or flight response in order to help us feel safe or keep us safe. During this process, the emotional and survival brain take over and elicit a number of changes in the body to prepare us to either run away or fight the stressor. Our pupils dilate so we can see better, our heart rate increases to maximize blood flow to our muscles, we start to sweat to cool the skin when in preparation for movement. And all of these processes are activated through the release of adrenaline and glucose in the body. During a fight or flight response, we don't need energy for digestion, so the sympathetic nervous system inhibits this function among other parasympathetic nervous system responses. The feedback loop that occurs between the brain and the body here reinforces the feelings of panic and stress.
So we've already looked at how things like diet, fatigue, problems at home, social pressure impact your ability to make good, effective decisions. The last bit we're missing here is what Jessie was just talking about, the impact of stress. And as we've seen, stress causes huge changes in the way your brain works and in the way your body works, has this big physiological impact, has a big impact on your ability to make decisions. As Jessie says, stress causes this physiological feedback loop. So it starts with being a bit worried about the job you're going to do, and then it causes these physiological responses. You start to, you find it hard to focus on anything except the cause of the stress. There are mistakes in communication happening on site. You've got this raised heart rate, a dry mouth, you're sweating, you get the nervous wheeze. All of this is releasing stress-related hormones, which helps to make you feel more stressed. So your brain is listening to your body. Your body is saying, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed. Your brain is responding to that by feeling more stressed, by focusing more on the cause of stress. You get this tunnel vision and loss of perspective. So a good example for tree workers is how hard work, physical stress, also activates that sympathetic nervous system. I mean, it's in that feedback loop. You're sweating already from the hard work. You've got the raised heart rate. The physical feelings of high stress are there already. And along with that, your ability to communicate or to make more complex plans is reduced. This is all part of that feedback loop, which exacerbates stress and reduces your ability to make rational, clear decisions. Which a really important thing to take away from that is that, safe, low energy methods of climbing or tree work are always worth choosing, because when you put a lot of physical stress on yourself, it will actually reduce your ability to make good decisions. So that tunnel vision we talked about, that's something that's really worth recognizing. Yeah, we're going to come back to this later on, but things like lateral thinking, coming up with very complex solutions, recognizing that you need to take a break, communicating well with your fellow workers, all of those rely on the engagement of your rational brain. And things like dropping into familiar shortcuts, they don't rely on it so much. That's what you're going to default to when you're stressed. And of course, your ability to think clearly and have perspective is affected as well. So to look at this example, particularly, a novice climber, they're scared of height, they're in a position they're not sure about, and they know they've got to rig the top out of this tree. They've been scared about it all morning. They're not looking forward to rigging the head out. The last time they did a job like this, maybe it went badly. So they're focusing on it. They've got these high levels of stress hormones floating around their body, sweating, pupils dilated, unable to really think about the rest of the job. In fact, they're probably at risk throughout the whole morning because they're so focused on this one risky thing they've got to do later in the day. The problem for them has stopped being how do they safely and efficiently conduct this tree job, and it started being how do I stop feeling like this? How do I make this horrible, sickening, terrified feeling come to an end? And that's where you'll see people do crazy things, that, particularly with very novice tree workers, student tree workers. You often see them setting up for this incredibly difficult, dangerous rigging job, like rigging out a massive piece of the tree because they're too scared to go any higher. Of course, once you're in that position, it's really hard to recognize that you need to take a break. It's so difficult to break yourself out of that cycle. So these are just some mechanisms you can use when you're up at the top of the tree, feeling stressed, feeling physically tired. Just take a really short break. It doesn't have to be long, just long enough to get the ground crew to send up some water. And whilst it's being sent up, just take a moment to be aware of your body, try and relax your muscles, try and get into a comfortable position, take long, slow breaths through your nose, relax a bit, get the water sent up, have that drink, send it back down. And even that short break and that period of relaxing yourself and taking those slow breaths will help to reactivate your sympathetic nervous system and help to calm you down, reduce those physiological indicators of stress, and break you out of that feedback loop. So just a bit of a recap. Good decision making relies on the rational conscious part of your brain being active and integrated with the enormous power of your subconscious brain. To do that, we have to be aware of the monitor and be aware of the other inputs into your subconscious brain. So things like diet, fatigue, and stress, you have to know those will affect your decision making, and you have to monitor your own capacity to rely on your emotional subconscious decision making. Along with that, things like company ethos and building good work practices are absolutely critical. So good communication with the crew, competence and experience for the job, a company ethos of not putting pressure on people to do work last thing in the evening, being supportive of them when they choose to walk away from the job, selecting efficient ergonomic work methods so you're not physically tired when you're making these decisions. All of that's going to be really important. The other thing that's really important is building good work habits. As you build ways of doing things, you settle into a pattern, a really strong habit that your subconscious mind will default to when you're tired or stressed. I mean, just think about the military as an example. That method of training, repetition, repetition, repetition. Get the recruits really stressed, make them tired, make them fatigued, and then repeat, repeat, repeat. And that builds those habits in really, really deep. And that ensures that, in a later moment in war, when they're very stressed, when they're fatigued, when they haven't been able to get a good meal for days, those same habits, those same practices will be bedded in so deep that they'll still keep doing things the same way. And tree work is very similar. If you start to get into habits of being a bit sloppy, of using the saw with one hand a lot, of detaching your lanyard and making cuts with only one point of attachment, those kind of bad habits, of transitioning from one system to another and moving into the new system without visually inspecting and loading the new system carefully before you detach the old one. Get into those kind of bad habits, and then when you're fatigued, when you're stressed, that's what you'll default to. And it'll get easier and easier and easier until those habits are bedded in so deep that when you're tired, you can't even change them. And of course, when you're tired, your subconscious brain is less able to notice those little visual cues that maybe are protecting you and letting you get away with those shortcuts when you're in a better physical condition. So it's just so important to build good, solid work habits, keep practicing, keep doing things the right way, so that when you're tired and stressed, that's what you'll default to. One of the most useful symptoms I've found of when the crew is stressed or fatigued or when their decision-making ability is compromised is actually communication. Because communication relies so heavily on that rational part of your brain, it's a great sign that people are feeling stressed or fatigued when they're no longer able to communicate with you clearly and well. So when there start to be these little miscommunications on site, or when you're talking to people and they become very short with the way they're speaking to you, struggling to explain things clearly, that's a good sign that they might be tired, they might be stressed, and for sure their decision-making ability is compromised, their tolerance of risk is increased. That's a great time to take a break, get them something to drink, make sure they have a bite to eat, get them away from the source of stress, let them settle down, and then come back to the work with a clear head. To conclude this presentation, we've talked a little bit about how you can monitor stress and fatigue in yourself, how you can recognize when your own decision-making ability is compromised. It's also really important to talk about the role of the employer. A couple of things there, really making sure that your employees fully understand the tasks they're conducting. That's so important, because when you're put into a position that you don't really understand, when you're pushed beyond the limits of your competency, that's where you start to feel stressed, and that's where you make these bad decisions. It's also really important to make sure that the crew really understand that they can walk away from a job. I can't think of anything as an employer that you can do to support your crew better than reiterating to them that if it's just not working, if they're having these miscommunications, if they're having that string of smaller mistakes that leads up to the big one, and they choose to leave the tree and come back another day, they've done the right thing. So reiterate that to them. I hope you've found this presentation useful. Please stick around for the Q&A afterwards, and please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions.